All right, everyone. Welcome back to another lecture for Comp 426 Modern Web Programming. This is lecture 2. So we'll have a chance to have everyone settle down for a moment. So we're going to be continuing the content that we talked about on Tuesday, building up our fundamentals of how the web works and how ultimately we're able to show web pages on our computer. So what we're going to get started with, and you'll see this now from here on out every lecture, is that we typically have an announcement slide. There'll always be a slide on this just to make sure that you all are aware of the different due dates that are coming up and various different things, and if there are any new assignments that are being released, etc. So we're going to get started with that here. So you can see there are currently 2 short assignments that are on Gradescope. We have reading 0, which is for the syllabus. And then we have reading 1, which is HTML and CSS fundamentals. And then there's another one that's going to be released today, but for kind of preparation for Tuesday's lecture, but it's going to be due Tuesday night. So it's only 15 questions or so. And some of you have actually, if you were in Chris Jordan's 590, you've actually probably already done this reading, but you'll get a chance to read it again. So this will help us introduce you to TypeScript, which is the programming language that we'll be using throughout the course. And so there will be ample time to do it. There's no expectation that you do it over the weekend, but it is, I'm just putting it here and releasing it. So if you want to get started on it, you are welcome to do so. Does anyone have any questions on any announcements or upcoming dates? All right. Another thing is that if you are new to the class, I know that there are a lot of people who are interested in joining the class. I was trying my best to get as many people in that I could. So some of you are new. I tried to sync the Gradescope roster. If you're not in it, though, I will sync it again today after class. But if you don't see Gradescope available, you can also let me know. I'll be walking around. There'll be an example today of we'll try and get everyone onto the Gradescope. So if you don't see it, I'll try my best to refresh it as we're doing that activity. All right? So with that being said, we can begin to kind of recap what we talked about on Tuesday. So last time we had this diagram. This is what we worked to. Really, the problem that we were trying to solve was how do we, on our computer, load some web page that is stored on an external server? All right, so we talked about the internet. We talked about this differentiation between clients and servers. And we talked about the fact that in order to communicate, we have this 2-part model of a request and a response. And that is how computers on the internet communicate, right? We also discussed the fact that these computers and on the network have IP addresses that allow us to identify those devices. And that makes it easy for us to be able to identify computers as we're trying to communicate with them. And then lastly, we talked about this fact of, well, as a user, we have a human readable version of a URL using some domain like apple.com. And that's the name as we know it of the website that we're trying to access. But of course, we need to convert that somehow into a location on the network, some IP address for a server that actually stores the files for that website. And so at the end of the lecture, we talked about DNS, domain name search or domain name system, that allows us to access these IP addresses. So when we want to load something like apple.com, our client will first, our computer will ask DNS for the IP address for apple.com. And then the second half, our computer will ask for that website from that server that was specified by the IP address. Are there any questions with any of this? I know there are a lot of new terminology last lecture, so I want to make sure that when I say things like client and server, it makes some sense. All right, and I will say today, because our official kind of TA staff starts on Monday, there are no TAs here today. So if I don't see you, you can kind of try to extend and raise your hand a little bit more so that I can see if you're in the back. All right. So that's what we talked about last time. And the final question that we ended up with when we were at the end, right? We have this process to load a web page from a server, but what actually makes up a web page? What files, what data, what resources are we ultimately trying to get from the server in order for us to be able to show a web page on our computer? And so we're going to kind of solve this and explain it by kind of breaking down what makes up a website, because that is very important for us to be able to know what are we actually, if we're asking for a website from a server, what are we requesting? What should the server be responding with? And so the core idea here is that any website that you have, whether it be something complex like apple.com, maybe it's the course website for Comp426 or any other website that you're pretty, you frequent regularly, they can all be broken down into what we call elements. And elements are kind of these core building blocks of our website. They actually are kind of the content, ultimately, that we're showing the user. So this includes things like, and again, I apologize, I'm using this laser pointer, but it probably is not showing up. So maybe I'll use my mouse if it shows up. There we go. So we have things like text. Right? That's on any website, we have text that the user is going to see. We may have things like links or images. Maybe we have sections, right? Different sections to organize our content, etc. And so any website that we ultimately try to access, like this one, this is the homepage for the UNC-CS website here, right? Every website that we have can ultimately be broken down into these common types of elements, right? So for example, you can see here that this is our website on its own, but we can begin to identify specific parts on this website and relate it to the elements that I had shown here. So you can see I've done that, where it's either some images, like for example, there's a news article right over here, which has an image of one of our esteemed professors. We have a logo at the top. We have a lot of text, right? Text is important. We have text like in our header here, and we have some text for our articles. And then we also, you can kind of see, and I know the lighting in here makes it a little bit hard, so if you have the slides open from the website, it might be more visible. There's also these kind of pale white sections that are or boxes on the website that correspond to sections. So like, for example, the header of our web page. So if I remove this, you'll see that, right, we have like a header there. We have a bar with different links for research, graduate, undergraduate, et cetera. This is a section on our web page. Right? So ultimately, our website and any website on the web are made up of these different elements. And so if we're trying to load a website and display it on our screen, we'll need to be aware of these different elements. In some way, we need a way to model these elements for our browser. Any questions so far? All right. And another thing here is that this is the same overall content structure you can see kind of abstracted out, right? So we had our website with content. If I just hide all the content, you can see how our site is made up of these different elements, some on top of each other, right? They're kind of nested, some just free floating around. All right. So the question then naturally is, if we have these websites and they're all made up of all these different types of elements, how does our browser end up knowing what these elements are in order to show it to us on our browser screen? Right? So the browser needs to know which elements appear on the website and how they are like kind of laid out so that it can show this to our user effectively. And so this is where HTML comes in. You may have heard of this at some point in your career here in the department. I know some classes, some talk a lot about web, like HTML and stuff. Others you might encounter it along the way, but not actually use it more in depth. So HTML, that is an abbreviation for hypertext markup language. And all its main purposes is to specify the content and ultimately the structure of our web pages. Ultimately, what elements are on our page. There we go. What elements exist on the page? So this is an example of what an HTML file ultimately looks like. So you can see there's many different parts here. And unfortunately, let me see if I can plug this in. I forgot to do this in the beginning of the lecture so that I can draw on my screen here so that I can highlight some things. So apologies for the delay. Let's get this in. Amazing. See if it works. Maybe. That's fine. Okay, it's not working right now. I'll get it to work. But basically, you can see here we have different things here. You'll notice that we have some text that you can see. Something like "Hello, students" is in our markup. We are super excited to have you in this class, right? That's some text. So how is this actually laid out? Ultimately, UI elements in HTML are described using these things called tags. So we have every single element in our HTML page is defined with a start tag and an ending tag. The start tag looks something like this. You have two of our angle braces, sometimes it's called, otherwise just less than and greater than, but typically in the world of web, we often call these angle brackets. So we have angle brackets, and then we have the name or the type of our element defined between them. So you can see here we have a start of an element with angle bracket element, and then the end of an element is denoted by the same thing, except there is a slash in the end of the element, right? Because if we have multiple elements defined, we want to be able to have different tags for starting and ending, so it's a bit less confusing. So again, the text between these angle brackets determines the type of element. Now this is defined by the HTML language ultimately, what these elements are called, but they correspond really well to the same type of elements that you would see on a web page, or even like that diagram that we showed in the beginning, where we have things like text, we have things like images, and we have sections. And so kind of the learning curve for HTML is just knowing which name of an element maps up with what you actually see on the web page. So for example, and I think I have a note here, right? I am picking out one element on our HTML. The reason why we know that this is one element is because we have a starting tag that says P, and then we have an ending tag here that says P, but there's a slash in it. So that's the difference between the starting and the ending tag. And one thing you'll find if you started the reading, and we'll explain this here, is that P denotes a paragraph. So this is a block of text on our page. So you can see here, that's the start of our paragraph, which is over here. We have the start. And then we have the end of our paragraph. So that leaves everything between the start and the end, which is the actual content of that element. So if we want to define a paragraph, we have a starting tag for a paragraph, then we have the content of the paragraph, and then we have the end of our paragraph. Are there any questions so far? All right. Another very important thing, and you also, if you were looking at that diagram that we showed in the beginning of the CS website, is that, well, elements can also exist inside of other elements, right? So remember, one of those things in our diagram, which we go all the way back to over here, right, was sections. We can have sections, but then inside of our sections, we might have other things like links or text and so on. As you can see down here, we have this section with hiring, course schedule, services, and events. That's a section, but inside of that section, we have links as well. Right? So we need to be able to put elements inside of other elements, and that's called nesting. So if we go back here, there we go. You'll see that elements can be nested, allowing for us to kind of preserve this, where we can have elements inside of others. And so you can see here that we have a paragraph element, except we have a paragraph element inside of a larger body element, because we have the start of our body, and then we have the end. And then between those two, remember that's the content, our paragraph goes right in there. Any questions so far? All right. So this is an example here that I've shown is, this is a full HTML document. And HTML documents, so when you request a website from the server, you'll receive one HTML page. And this HTML has a certain structure to it that'll be common on all the web pages that you try to load. And that looks something like this. So you'll notice that our entire HTML document starts with an HTML tag and then ends over here with a closing HTML tag. So everything between those two is the content of our HTML, except we have two sections. We typically have a head section at the top, and then we have a body section. And the body is, I guess, the easiest to describe because that is where the actual elements that you see on your web page, that's where they exist. So all of the elements that exist, all the content of the web page is defined in the body. But we also have a head section, which I guess specifies what we call metadata. Metadata is just additional information about our web page that is important for the browser to know. For example, the title. Because when you load a web page on your browser and you have all these tabs, right, there's some text on each tab that says this is like the name of the web page. That is what title would specify. It's like, for example, here, if I exit out of full screen, you'll see that if I go to COM42625F, right, and then I go to another tab, you'll see it says COM426 Modern Web Programming, right? That's not part of the content of the web page, but it's still important to know. So hopefully. It looks like this ran out of battery. So in our break, I will go ahead and fix that. But for now, I should be able to hopefully talk loudly enough. So we'll put this over here. Always unfortunate. I feel like every other week, this usually dies in the middle of in the other classroom. So hopefully it doesn't do that again. So we do apologize for that. I'll try my best. I guess I have this. I can try to use this. All right. Great. All right, we're back. So what would this actually look like from the browser, right? You can see over here, we have this example HTML document. I've said that this is supposed to represent the content of our web page. So what would this actually look like in the browser? So there's a really cool tool that we'll be using, especially in the beginning of the semester, called StackBlitz. Some of you may have heard of it. This might be new for some of you. It's this online tool that allows us to, it's like a mini development environment that contains a lot of the setup that we need to run this stuff. One of the great things is that it has a side-by-side between a browser and then code. So I can show you the code, and then you'll be able to see the actual web page from it. So you can try navigating to this link. First, I will note that this slide should be public. Please let me know if it's not. I published it right before lecture. So you can go to those slides and click on the link, or you can type it in at go.unc.edu/426-L02-HTML. All right, so I'll give everyone kind of a minute if you're copying it down, and then I'll go and open it in the browser. All right, so I'm going to click on this link now that you have seen it. And what you should see when we open this up is something like this. And so you should have the ability to edit it, I believe. It'll edit it locally in your computer. It'll say that it creates like a fork or something. But the basic, the base structure is here. So I'm going to open this up and kind of make this a little bit bigger. There we go. Amazing. So you'll notice that this is the exact same HTML that we had on the slide. We had a section for our head, and then we have our body, and our body contains different elements inside of it. We have hello students, and then we have 2 paragraphs. And you'll notice that then on my web page over here, that's the exact content. The exact content I specified in HTML is what we end up seeing in our browser. Another cool thing with StackBlitz is that you can click on this little pop-up on the side here that says Open Preview. And this will actually open it in a full new tab. You just have to press Connect to Project, and then you'll see it like fully in your browser. So you get the full experience as if this is the website that you got from some server somewhere. Right, so you can see that now my web page has appeared. Right? Now, I'm going to show one thing here, and then we'll go back to the Stack Blitz. So, any questions so far with any of this? All right. So there's also another interesting thing here, which you'll actually get a chance to experiment with in a moment, which is the fact that we have defined these elements as having an opening tag and a closing tag, except sometimes for certain elements, we might need to supply some additional information. And those informations can be passed in like so. And this is what's known as a property. So for example, for images, we use a tag called img image. This defines an image, except the link to our image does not go between the start and the end. Rather, it is passed as a property. So we say source, src, which is the source of our image, and then we pass in a URL to the image here. There's different elements and there's different reasons as to why. I think one of the very common ones which makes sense as to why we would do this rather than just putting the link in the content is like with a link, right? So in a link, you might have a link on a web page that says click here, but that's not the URL, right? That's like what the user sees. And so instead, there would be a property that specifies the actual redirect URL, and then you have the content as something else. So that's the reason why we can't just put everything often in the content. We sometimes need properties to append to. And in the reading, you'll actually have a chance to look at this a bit more because I think there's an example of links and images as well. All right, so now with this, if you want to go back to the Stack Blitz, you'll notice that there's a challenge here. And so we showed you what an image tag looks like. I realize that is terrible to see. Let me see if I can switch that. There we go. Sorry to those who hate light mode. Unfortunately, though, for these classrooms, light mode is much easier to see. So you'll see here that we have a challenge, and just working with someone near you, try to add an image of an animal. So you can get this image, like the link to the image from the internet, but we also have some images located here. So in our file structure, we have and you can find here files. And we have some links to some animals. So you might not know and maybe intuitively how to do it. You can try it out. You're also welcome to use a resource online to try and see what the official documentation says. We'll spend a few minutes on this, and then we'll come back together and show you how it works. All right, so we had a chance to give everyone some time. I think we saw a lot of different images up. I will note that there was one problem with the axolotl image. So if you tried that one and it didn't work for some reason, I'm not entirely sure why. I'll have to check. I'll have to look into that. But some of the other images did work. So I'm going to show you. So this is the same type of image tag that we had in our slide. And then remember, we have our source. This most of you tried. So we have our source property. And then we can try any of these images. Now, one thing you'll note, and if you had some trouble, you may have played around, you may have looked online and found that the way that this works is that typically we will use relative paths for these images. There's actually a pretty good reason why. So if you think about this from our client-server relationship, right, that we have, if you used an absolute path and it said something like home / and then like your name / something, that's a direct absolute path to a file on your computer in a certain folder, right? And most of the time when we load these web pages from a server, right, it's being loaded in our browser. So we don't have, like, that file doesn't get downloaded directly to disk. So that's the reason why we need to have a relative path. And I'll show you here, like, animals squirrel.jpg. And if I save and then refresh my sample website, you should see now that we have a squirrel on our screen. All right. Did anyone have any questions based off of any of this? Yeah. Good question. So this is actually, the reason for this is mainly as the example, just to reinforce that there is an opening and closing tag. There are many elements in HTML where you only need one one tag, and it just typically it's just you don't need a closing tag for them, or you add like an abbreviated version where you remove it and then you put like a slash at the end. And this is what they call a self-closing element. So you can do this as well. Many of you have probably, if you've used HTML, you're more used to this version. Totally fine. Just wanted to kind of drive home the example with just one type, but you will see this as well at some point in the future. So great question. Yep. Any other questions? All right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Is the server or the client like load the website?
Yes, great question. So does the client or the server end up loading this website? So in the end, what's simulated here, and actually this is a good question because I think StackBlitz kind of makes this a bit obscure. So what StackBlitz does, and you'll kind of see this down here, where I highlight, and I don't think my tablet is still not doing anything, but you'll see down here in the terminal of StackBlitz, there is this link to it says network, and it kind of gives us this sample URL here with an IP address. So what StackBlitz is doing is it's kind of simulating a server that would be on the network. And then our client, when we go to this URL here, when we go to this website, it's just downloading that HTML file. So ultimately, the browser itself is what is showing the website, because that is our client is our computer. So the browser is sitting on our computer. So that would be the client side. Yep. The server is just kind of there to store this file so that when we need it, it would just give it to us. Okay. Perfect. Hopefully that didn't confuse anyone more. Is any other questions here? Great. And we'll talk a lot about this type of stuff throughout the class. I just mainly wanted to show like what the browser would show based on like a sample HTML page. All right. So great, most of you were able to get an image to show up. And so source is an example again of a property. There are different properties on different elements. You'll see some of this through the reading, but also gain just some experience as you go through the class, because HTML specifies dozens of different elements. Really, there's only maybe a dozen or so that you end up using a lot, and then there's some more obscure ones. And so the most common ones will be like images or links that have these properties, but I just am putting this here so that you know that they exist. Now, another thing is that all elements share two properties known as class and ID. And so no matter what type of element it is, whether it's a paragraph, whether it is a header like H1 up there, that was like a larger text, that was a header, or our image, all of these tags can take a class or an ID. The purpose of these two will become more clear in a moment. But the key thing here is that they're used to essentially identify or group together similar elements. So for class, we can supply a class property on multiple elements and pass in the same string. And that will allow us to group these elements as related together. Again, we'll see an example, a practical example of this in a moment. And then ID is like a unique identifier. So we can, if we really need later on, you'll see as we start working with actual code, if we need to like, identify just one element on our site, we can do that with a unique ID. But the key thing here, the only reason why I'm putting this here is so that you know that some properties like source are only for like a certain type of element, like image, but class and ID can be placed on any element in our body. All right? Any questions? Great. Now, another really cool thing here is that since every single web page that we load on our computers in our browser is ultimately it's ultimately specified in an HTML file, we can actually see the HTML file of any web page that we load. So I want to demo this, and this will actually this will be part of our kind of mock attendance check for the day. We're not taking attendance, but I'm going to show you what the process typically is like. So make sure that you follow here. So we can view, usually in almost every browser, you can view the raw HTML of a currently loaded web page using something called developer tools. And developer tools are applicable on Safari, on Chrome, on Firefox, on all the various browsers. I'm going to demo Chrome because that's the most prevalent one, and their tools are pretty nice. So I'm going to show you all how to, and there's, unfortunately, today, no TAs, just me, but I'll try to answer any questions you all have, right? So I'm going to go to Chrome here, and I lost my mouse for some reason. Let me see if I can fix that. There we go. All right, so I'm going to go here, and let's just load something. I know we've been picking on Apple, so I'll go back to apple.com. And what you'll find is if you already have developer tools set up, and you can check if you do by right-clicking anywhere on the website. So if you're on a Mac, it's a 2-finger press or control-click. On Windows, it's a right-click to open up a menu. And you should see this tool called Inspect at the bottom. All right? If you do not see Inspect in your list of options, you can go into your Chrome settings. So there's on the top right, there's an icon. You can press on Settings and then go, I believe, let's see. I actually think it's usually, see, let me look here if there's a, actually, sorry, I went to the wrong place. I think this may have moved from the last time I did this. If you go to the icon and highlight over more tools over here, you should see developer tools as an option. You can click that, and that should also show you the same thing. All right, so when you do this and you press inspect, what you'll see here is at the bottom, it opens up a whole bunch of text. And this is all HTML. This is the HTML that ultimately, when we go to apple.com, this is the HTML file that is downloaded from the server. All right, so you can see here, there's a lot of stuff in here. So you don't have to be too, I guess, worried about what some of this means. But the cool thing is that there is like an element selector in Chrome. So on the left-hand side, let me see if I can, there we go. I can make this bigger. So on Chrome, there is this element selector on the side, on the left hand of the pane. If you click it, you can actually highlight over individual items on this page. And I think Apple, this site is, let me go to my own website, because Apple puts links over all of their sections. Let me go to Com426. This is last semester's site. Let's go to the new one. F. There we go. Internet is very slow, apparently. All right, here we go. And so if I were to highlight over any of these elements, by clicking here, you can highlight, and it will actually show you where in your HTML that is defined. So like, for example, under important links, if I click on it, you'll see that this is a H2 element, which stands for, which is also a heading. And that is what is ultimately showing that on our page. Another really cool thing with developer tools is you can actually modify the HTML in the developer tools and in real time see changes on your site. So like I could say here, instead of just important links, I could say very important links. And you'll see that our web page immediately updates to show you what our site looks like if our HTML changed. All right. Are there any questions here? All right. So what I would like to do now, and this is, I think, the next part of this, is just to kind of go over how attendance checks will typically work. So they're in different formats, but typically all of them are either submitted on Gradescope or they're turned in person. Today, we're doing Gradescope. And so if you go to Gradescope, you should see an assignment that says like L02, attendance check, something like that. And because, again, this is the first week, there are people dropping, being added to the class. Some people are surveying other classes. We're not creating this one at all. The purpose of this one is just to show you how the process will work. And so what I'd like you to do is to have the browser developer tools open. You can take a screenshot of it and then just submit it as a photo upload to Gradescope. And again, in Gradescope, you click on it, and there should just be a box for you to upload an image. You just upload it and press submit, and that is all. All right, so that is how majority of our attendance checks will be. Sometimes we might have like physical pieces of paper. I know that this room and the desks are not that great, so we'll see how that goes. But if there's like some diagramming that you do, or maybe some other photos that you take with a partner, various different mediums, but ultimately they'll all be submitted nearly the same way. All right, so we'll give everyone a few minutes to do this. I'll walk around if there are any questions, and then we can continue on with some more content here. All right, so hopefully everyone had the chance to do that. If you're still getting it in, no worries. Also, a bit of a side note for you all. Just make sure it would have been good, I think, for these steps to have some. They're exactly the same pattern, so it's kind of be careful if you're walking down at any point, not to trip down the stairs. All right. Everyone good with this? Good. Okay. So again, this is the format that we'll use for attendance checks throughout the semester. Again, it's mainly just to make sure that you're here and engaged. There's no, we're not grading for accuracy on this stuff. All right. Any questions? All right. Perfect. So another thing that you'll notice on the site that we have here. And also one thing I will note real quick, because this is a particular feature, I believe, of this room. This room is typically a room used for music. And so there's very good acoustics. So even if you're talking very quietly, it funnels in and echoes toward the front. So just make sure that if you are talking, make sure that you keep it low and try to focus. That way the people in the front are able to still kind of follow along. All right, perfect. So one thing that you'll notice in the site that we loaded on our page is that it looks very plain, right? So if I go back here to the website that I had open, which was over here, with our squirrel, there's really nothing here, right? It's just text. It looks as if it's like the Times Roman-esque font on it. There's no colors, no style, etc. And this is a very important observation, because HTML's job is just to define the content of a web page, not how it looks, not styling, nothing like that. Only the elements that exist on the page and the content in those elements. And so we use the second tool, and there's a second type of file that our server provides the client when we download a web page called CSS, which is short for cascading style sheets. And CSS is used to apply styles to elements on our web page. So here is an example of what this might look like. So we have a HTML file, and then on the right-hand side, we have a CSS file. So if I didn't say this before, our HTML file has a .html extension. Our CSS is a .css extension. Perfect. So the first thing here is that you'll notice that in the metadata of our web page in HTML, we have a link element. And the link element is used to specify the path for our CSS file. So you can see here we have link, we have rel, which is style sheet. That's just talking about the type of item we're linking to. And then we have href, which is our reference to that file. And so if they're in the same folder directory, you can just write styles.css, and that will link the two. It's in the metadata because the browser then knows when it's reading the HTML that this is the CSS file that it needs to connect to and use those styles when rendering the page. Right? Does that make sense? Any questions there? All right. And then how these styles are, this is known as a style sheet. How these styles are actually defined is a combination of what we call selectors and rules. So selectors, which you can see is highlighted in blue at the top, is it's used to specify which elements we actually want to apply certain styles to. And then we have rules, which I have highlighted in yellow, which are the specific styles that we want to apply to the elements that we have selected with the selector. So at the top, you can see that we have header, and then inside of that, our rule is that we're setting a color to blue. right? And so there are different types of selectors. And this is kind of where our class and our ID attributes that we talked about, or those properties that can go on any element, this is where they come in. And this is why they can go on any element, because any element should be able to be styled. So if we want to select a specific element, like one type of element, we can supply an ID to the element, like so. So you can see with H1, I said ID equals header. And then we can select the element with that ID by preceding that with a pound symbol or hashtag, right? So you can see here we have, again, pound or hashtag header. And that selector will select an element in our HTML with the ID set to header. And then it will style that particular element. Any questions with that? All right. And then class, if you remember, I kind of mentioned that ID is like unique for one element, class is for a collection of elements. Well, here, if we want to select like multiple elements at once, we can have all those elements share a class and then select it using a period. So you have here, we have dot text, and that selector will apply styles to all of the elements with the class name that is specified after the period. So we have dot text, which means that all of the styles will be applied to the paragraphs with a class of text. Yeah. Yes, so you have full, great question. So you can name these like IDs or classes. They're arbitrary. You can set them to anything you would like. So text and headers are not something I chose them. They're not like built into the language in any way. Perfect. And also another thing is there might be some, I don't remember off the top of my head, but there's might be some rules regarding like special characters, like at symbols and again, pound symbols are periods that you cannot include because CSS can't recognize them. So typically having raw just alphabet A through Z text separated by hyphens should be good. All right, questions there? All right. And then we also can just select all the elements of a single type by not including a pound symbol or a dot and just writing it out. So if I want to select all the images on my entire site, I could just write IMG as my selector. If I wanted to select all of the paragraphs on this in this site, I would have just done P. All right. And so I will open up a quick example here. Whoops. All right. Let's close this and this. All right. So we'll go here and then open this. I don't think this goes anywhere. Let me see if I can fix that. So that would be edu L02 or 426 L02 CSS or HTML CSS. Let me see if I have the link for that. If not, that's all right. Okay, so I don't have the link, so I'll just show it on my computer. You probably will not be able to access it. So let me go and do that real quick. Let me sign in using GitHub here. There we go. And I think that there is an example somewhere in my list of projects for this. So let's see L02, HTML and CSS, this one. All right. Okay, here we go. So unfortunately, I don't have a link for that, but I will provide the link later. I'll put it in the slides after the fact. So you'll see here that now my site looks a little bit different, and that's because I have linked to an external style sheet. So I've supplied a link right here, which goes to styles.css. I can open styles.css, and you can see that I have applied some styles. So I have like H1, which is selecting all of our headers. And I'm giving it a red text color. So you can see color red makes our text red. And then I am also supplying a border. So I have border, and the way that the border one works is we have a width of our border. We have the type like solid, dashed lines, etc., and then the color. What I want you to note here is not necessarily the specific styles I'm using, just kind of the format of what CSS looks like. Because there are a lot of styles, and you'll see throughout the class that we will be working with this like for the entire semester. So you don't have to learn all of CSS right now. What we're seeing here are mainly just some examples, and the reading goes into this as well a little bit. Are there any questions with this? All right. Perfect. So I want you to kind of show, or I want you to see how much of an effect CSS has on a website. So I'm going to go to a sample website here, which is going to be Amazon. And I'm actually going to do it in Safari because this will allow me to do this here. So go to Amazon. And if I right click, and there's a setting here that allows me to disable CSS. And I can show you that if I disable CSS, what Amazon's website actually looks like if we just use HTML. So you can see we have a bunch of random floating images here. And then all of our links for like signing in, our cart, our account, our order, everything that's hidden behind menus are just listed out as elements in our HTML. Here's a giant image, right, without any styling on it. And we can continue. You'll see that there's different things here. Video player is loading, everyday essentials, etc. So you can see that there is a lot of stuff that is ultimately a lot of what we see when we interact with websites is actually controlled with CSS. Now, there might be another thing you'll notice here, and I'll give a hint, which is about the layout. So does anyone have any thoughts about what changes, right, with my layout when I go from something like this, right, to something like this? Is there anything that you might notice about what happens here? Any volunteers? There we go, yeah. Exactly, yes. Everything shifts to the left. We have nothing, everything is hugging the left edge of my screen. I have nothing that is anywhere else. And so that's something that is very important to note because we say that HTML is kind of the content and the structure of our web page, but layout is not something that HTML does besides just stacking elements like beneath each other on the left-hand side, okay? So ultimately then, what this is showing is that we need to use CSS to be able to affect how elements are laid out on our page. Are there any questions with that key idea? All right. So again, key thing that to note here that when we disabled CSS, not just colors and fonts and styles, like styles in the sense of what we typically think of, which is fonts and colors, but also it changed the layout. And so it's very important to keep in mind here that layout is affected by the combination of CSS and HTML, right? So without CSS, we cannot provide, our layout is just going to be hugging the left side of our screen. We need CSS in order to affect how elements are laid out on our screen. Any questions? Great. So again, as you've seen by default, if we have no CSS, all elements on our web page get placed top to bottom on the left side of the screen. And of course, this is not how websites are typically arranged, and it would be very hard to use if websites were all arranged that way. And so CSS also, in addition to just providing some topical or cosmetic changes like colors and whatnot, also allow us to manipulate how items are arranged on the screen. One thing we'll note here, and this is a caveat because we're going to spend the entire semester doing this, but making good layouts and implementing layouts is a hard skill, and it takes a while to master, especially because CSS is a really powerful tool. There's so many different types of styles. And so we're going to, we'll have the chance to implement this throughout the semester. So do not feel like, after this lecture, you need to know how everything, like how CSS works. We're going over the high level right now, and then as we go through the different assignments, you'll have a chance to really play around and learn more about styling. All right, sound good? So I want to now go over some basics here to think about layout, because layout is a really important part, and we'll kind of talk about how CSS affects layout at a high level. So the first thing here is that the area, kind of that the entire browser screen, what the browser kind of shows as that white background, that is known as the layout viewport. And so what the layout viewport is that it is the area of the browser that elements of a web page are arranged on, ultimately. So it's like the entire window of our browser. That is our layout viewport. And the layout viewport has a width and a height, right? Because it is a rectangle. These are measured often with pixels. So you'll see this abbreviation px a lot. That stands for pixel. And that is kind of the unit that we use to define the height and width. Now, the actual height and width of our layout viewport is determined by the device loading web page, right? So if I'm on my phone, it might be more taller than wide, right? If I'm on a laptop, it might be it'll be the other orientation. If I'm an ultra-wide monitor, our width is really, really wide, but our height might be shorter. And so ultimately, the size that we're working with is going to change depending on what device we are using. So again, if this is our layout viewport, we have a width and we have a height, width and height. Width and height. I think I put I motioned in the wrong way there. All right. Now another thing which we've already talked about is the fact that elements they start off in the top left corner and then they get stacked beneath. So they are aligned with the left-hand side and they start from the top left corner. And so the top left corner is actually what you can consider to be the origin if we think about our width and height and our layout viewport as like a grid of pixels. So 0, 0, as we would consider on a graph, that is going to be in the top left, right? So if we are positioning something based on pixels, 0, 0, that is the top left of our site. And both directions to the right is a positive increase in our x direction, and y down is a positive increase as well. So that's a bit different from like a Cartesian plane that you might have used in a math class, which is that as you go down as you go downward, you decrease in the y direction. In the context of a browser, we increase as we go down. But 0, 0 is the top. Questions here? Great. And so one of the most fundamental concepts of CSS that I want to introduce here is what's known as the box model. So the box model it sounds a lot more complicated than what it actually is. All it is it's just describing how an element is positioned on the page relative to elements around it. And so you'll see here, there's 3 pieces that I am saying that the box model describes. The first one is where the element is positioned compared to elements around it. The second one is how are the contents of an element actually positioned within the element, which we'll get to. And then third is the property of the border or the boundary of our element. So these are the 3 things that the box model ultimately describes. I think it'll make more sense as I show a diagram here. So this is what you would ultimately see as a model of what we call the box model. This is a diagram of that model. And the first thing I want to highlight, because I think it's a good place to start, is the border. So the border of our element is denoted right here. You can see it's in a gray outline. And because all of our elements have an implicit border around them, sometimes they are hidden, like in the sense that you can't really see it because it's just 0 pixels wide. It is there. Or if you have certain styles that you applied, like the style that I applied here, if I go back here, you'll see that there is a border around my text. That border is the same border that I'm describing in this diagram. So it's kind of like our outer boundary of our element. And we can make the border show up by applying a border style to it. Otherwise, typically, if I remove this, you wouldn't see the border. We have Stackblitz is a bit slow, but again, just like our previous example without this, you wouldn't see the border if we removed it. Except it's still there. It doesn't go away. It's just that the width is technically like infinitesimally small. Okay? And then we have our content. The content would actually be in my paragraph, the actual text that's inside of the paragraph. That is the content. And so we have a border typically around our element, and then we have the content of our element, except you'll see here in my diagram, this green space. And this green space is between my border and my content. And this is important because there are a lot of times where we want to inset our content away from our border. And we do that by applying what is called padding. So padding is just a space between the element's border and any content inside of our inside of our element. And so if I go back here, I'm going to briefly show this. And we'll have a larger example here. Let me see if I can refresh so that this appears on my screen here. Perfect. So if I just type in a padding value, and now let's say I apply some padding, you'll notice that now I've added space between where my text starts and the actual border of my element over here. Any questions so far? Good. And then lastly, on the outside of our border, we have another measure that we can add to affect position, and that is known as margin. So margin is the space outside of the border of our element. And so if we want to, let's say, we are saying all of our elements are hugging the left-hand side. If we wanted to move it over and have a, let's say, 100 pixel space between that edge and our border, we can do that by supplying a margin. So for example, if I go back here and I apply margin left of 100 pixels and I save, you'll notice that now my element has moved over 100 pixels. So there's 100 pixels of space between what is on the other side of it, which is just the edge of my screen, and the start of my border. Any questions with that? Yeah. Yes, so that's something that is sometimes a bit hard to see because it doesn't really look like, it looks like our paragraph just stops at the border, but technically margin is part of the specification of the element. And I can actually show this as well by going into that same inspect mode because it's really, really cool. This is part of DevTools, and I think Safari shows it too. You'll notice on the bottom right that we have a very similar diagram to the one that I have on my slide. And if I were to select or highlight over this element, you'll see that it actually shows me what that box model looks like in relation to my element. So you can see my element is the entire thing, including that orange portion. But I have my text, which is blue, that's the content. I have some space between my text and my border, that's the padding. I have a border, and then I have my margin around it. Right? And so if I hover, you'll notice that everything, including the margin, is part of that element. So when I click on this, it highlights this element. All right? Yeah.
Should we edit padding? Should we edit margin when?
Great question. So this is so in the case if you don't have a border at all, it may seem as if it doesn't really matter. Yeah, padding or margin will maybe visually do the same thing. Typically, what we recommend is that if you're trying to move an element in a space like how we did here, would recommend use margin. And then padding should only be used if you're trying to inset the content in some way if there's a border visible. Yeah, technically you can get away with doing both, and there's no error or anything that happens. It's just a best practice that is recommended. But great question. Any other questions? All right. So this is the box model. You'll see this, and again, when I talk about it's this abstract thing, there's all these, it's a diagram, but ultimately all we're doing is just affecting spacing and position, both inside and around our element. And so more specifically, how we actually do this in CSS is we have various different styles that we can apply, different rules. So we have things like margin, which allows us to specify 4 values for top, bottom, left, and right. And then we also have our margin, we can specify just a specific one, like margin top, and affect that. We have padding, same thing. We have padding left, padding right, padding top, padding bottom, okay? And then we also have a width and height. So these are various styles that you might apply in order to affect the layout of your site. Now, one thing which I think, especially if you have done HTML CSS before. And I know that for a lot of you, what we're doing today is a review. I did see the survey. A majority of people have seen this stuff before. This is meant for making sure that everybody is able to get the same foundation going into the material. So I apologize. I know it's Thursday. It's late of the first week. Might be falling asleep if you've already seen this. But that's the reason. Except this is something that you might not realize if you've done HTML and CSS before, is that the width and height property that you apply just affects the height and width of the content of the blue block, not anything else. So only the content, the blue block, is what's affected when you supply a width or you supply a height. And so that's why you might have some weird things sometimes where it's like, hey, I applied a 300 pixel width. Why is this larger than that? That might be because you have a 300 pixel width, but you also have padding that is being that's added, or a margin that's added, and that makes changes the spacing. So if you want like the full width and height, like how much space does this take up? Like how much space on my page is taken up by this element? You'd have to actually do some math, unfortunately. So padding, like margin, if you want the width, it would be margin left plus border, the left border width, plus the padding left, plus the center, padding right, border, margin right. Or you might omit the margin if you're just looking for the space between each edge of the border. Any questions here? All right, so that's something that also was, this surprised me when I first saw it, but it is and I guess it makes sense, because if you are supplying padding, you wouldn't want to have to do a bunch of subtraction to figure out what your width and height would be of your actual content. So width and height just affect the content. All right. And I actually jumped the gun and already showed this. But again, in your developer tools, you have the ability to see the box model. And you can play around with it too. So if I go back here, and you can try this as well on your own site. Unfortunately, I don't have the link for this one. I'll put it up. But if you watch here, and I can try to apologize. I actually notice when I stand closer to this wall, there's more of an echo than over there. So I'm not sure why. I'll see if I can figure that out. But if I can modify these live, so like I can set this padding to 100, and you'll see that it actually changes on my site. So this is a great way to experiment with layouts before you write the code. You can write something, edit it in developer tools, and then write your code based on that. Or like margin, 100 margin, you can see adds a space of 100 between the element above it and my border. All right. Questions here? Amazing. So let's see here where we are at. Oh yeah, there's one thing which is actually good. We still have 5 minutes, so we'll very briefly cover this, but you'll see this a lot in our first assignment, which will just be making a website here, is that you'll notice that we have this box model, which helps us to affect layout. But there's another thing, which is like, how do we have elements kind of next to each other in a row? Because so far we've just been dealing with columns. And even if we add margin and padding, we don't know how to place things next to each other yet. We only have a column. And so we can do that by changing something known as the display mode. So there's built-in display modes in CSS. You don't really need to know a lot of this. The only one we're really going to talk about is the one at the end called the flex display mode, because it's really, really powerful. And again, you don't have to worry about this right now. There'll be a lot more detail specified about this later. So I know we are short on time, but the key idea here is that with the flex display mode, we can specify whether we want elements in a container to be arranged in a column or in a row. That's the key idea. So and just the combination of having rows and columns, pretty much you're able to design nearly every layout that you want just with combinations of rows and columns. And we'll again see some examples in a bit. And I'll send some extra resources out too. All you have to do to get this set up is you have what's known as a div element. This is in the reading as well. It's just commonly used for containers. Like it just put a bunch of elements and section them together. And you can apply a style called display flex which makes that everything in that content, or every element inside of it, it changes the way that it is laid out. So we can either set our flex direction to a column, which means if we have a container and we have multiple elements inside of the container, they're placed in a column, or we can set it to a row, and so then every element inside can be placed horizontally. Something like this. So you'd have like an outer div here, which you could set flex direction to row, and then let's say you have multiple paragraphs inside of that div, they'll be placed left to right, or you can go with a column. And now real quick, because we still have 2 minutes, I apologize because I know that people are excited, but does HTML or CSS then determine the layout of the web page? What do you all think here? Which one? Both. I love it. Some of you may have already seen the slide, so you know, if you're one of those, hopefully you know why. But yes, both, because CSS is required for the box model and for flex layout like rows and columns, but HTML also supplies the nesting that is needed for things like flex boxes to work, right? Because we have a container, we have multiple elements inside of that container. That is only possible because they are nested inside of HTML. All right? So remember this question we talked about: what files make up a website? We've introduced HTML and we've introduced CSS. And next week, we'll talk a little bit more about how websites can become interactive. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me in the front. I'd be happy to answer any emails as well. And we'll see you all on Tuesday.